Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. On today's episode, Professor Stephen Kenny, Senior Lecturer in 19th and 20th century North American history at the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. Professor Kenny discusses his article, A Dictate of Both Interest and Mercy, Slave Hospitals in the Antebellum South. Beginning on the shores of West Africa, white doctors began to systematize racialized medicine in the service of slavery, establishing institutions of idealized models of slave care. The story of slave hospitals became a self-serving lie of enslaver benevolence and racial difference. Plantation hospitals were rooms or shacks, while urban spaces resembled prisons. The role of slavery is undeniably linked to the development of medical procedure and professionalism.
I'm Stephen Kenny. I'm in the Department of History at the University of Liverpool, and here I teach and research on the topics of slavery, racism, health, and medicine, mainly in the era of antebellum slavery, but also Jim Crow segregation.
Well, thank you for agreeing to be part of this series. Today we're going to be talking about your article from 2010 called A Dictate of Both Interest and Mercy, Slave Hospitals in the Antebellum South. So I'd like you to begin by telling us how you came to write this article and what you found out in the scholarship.
Yeah, I'll try not to be too long-winded in covering what we might call today, my positionality or the location of the researcher in relation to the topic of research or the research subject. But it is a good thing for me to reflect on, because I'm from a town. I'll say more about being in the Liverpool context, because I think that's very relevant here. But I'm from a town close by to Liverpool, 13 miles to the east, a glass-making, coal mining, chemical manufacturing town called St. Helens, which is, I think if I was to be brutally honest about it, an industrial and environmental disaster zone. And it has, over the years, over the centuries really, undermined population health in a number of ways for many generations. And that's also true of family health. And I also think that growing up, I did become aware of the impact very early on of living in that place on people's health. And also the difficulties of getting effective healthcare, which was very often something of a lottery, often unsatisfactory, and now, of course, is impossible for many. So as a result of poor air and general poor environment there, disability was everywhere growing up, as was deference to paternalistic or authoritarian and very often condescending medical professionals. And then going into education, first of all, before higher education, I took a job when I first left school. That didn't work out. It was the Thatcher era. Holding on to a job was very difficult. So I decided I'd go back to college and study to go to university. And one of the things I really enjoyed was social and economic history, and looking at the health of so-called working class in industrial Britain. But when I got to university, I became very interested in the African American experience, the history of slavery. And I took every course I could on that topic. I was lucky enough at that point in time, when the government used to fund degree programs, gave maintenance grants for students, lucky enough to go to the States and to go to South Carolina And it was while I was at the University of South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, that I had my first encounter with an effigy of James Marion Sims on the State House grounds there. And it blew my mind because the year before, I'd taken a women's history course, Second Wave Feminism, and a book on that course was Graham Barker Benfield's The Horrors of the Half-Known Life, in which Sims and his contemporaries in the medical profession in the States were described in very clear and explicit terms for what they were, which was sexist and racist and exploitative. And when I was in South Carolina, I thought, who on earth put this statue here? For what reasons? What were their motivations? Do they not know the kind of second wave feminist version history of Sims? So that really grabbed my interest. And I did my undergraduate dissertation on Sims. And I wondered whether or not he was typical, whether or not he was representative. And that became the basis of PhD research. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I do want to highlight that they are, I think, meaningful motivations for getting into this topic.
Well, it's incredibly fascinating how you got there. So I would like to begin with a discussion, if you would, of what slave hospitals, infirmaries, sick houses were, and how they functioned initially on the plantations. And I guess we can also get into at this point, like how we came to understand them through the scholarship as well. That's a two-part question, I suppose, but that's...
Yeah. So in the article that we're discussing, the 2010 article, I'm trying to do several different things to assess in some senses, the scale, the number of these facilities, the different types of hospitals for the treatment of enslaved people, and then the functions in some ways. So in the article, and also here, I think it's useful to speak from the Liverpool perspective. So here I am in Abercrombie Square, University of Liverpool, not too far away from the docks, from the port, and not too far away from the site of the first Liverpool infirmary, which was built in 1749, which was also the location where physicians who wanted to get into the transatlantic slave trade came to be licensed, or came to be licensed in particular after the passage of the Daubin Act in 1782, which required that there should be, in order to have an impact on mortality, reducing mortality rates on slave ship voyages, the idea was that a trained physician would have some impact on that devastating rate of mortality. That did not play out in the way intended. So hundreds of physicians were licensed in Liverpool at the infirmary. We've got records of at least 650, and they were the second best paid people on the slave ship. And they gained additional profit, sometimes where it was possible, by taking what were called a privilege from the cargo of enslaved people for their own profit, paid in people as well as being paid in cash. And this must have become, over the decades, an embedded practice on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as on the West African coast, to take that privilege, to make capital from sickness and suffering. And so we can see On the North American side, the setting up of hospital facilities in order to process so-called season, forcibly transported, trafficked, enslaved people, to rehabilitate them after that just impossibly grueling, arduous, physically, psychologically, emotionally impactful journey, to try to get them in a state of health fit for sale, for the economy of slavery. So there were facilities set up like that in order to try and prevent infectious diseases spreading in North American port cities. First and foremost, probably the earliest one imagines hospital facility was a quarantine station, and we see these in Charleston and Savannah. I believe one in Savannah was over 9 stories tall. Must have been an enormous structure. And again, it's a way of kind of a crude public health measure, not really to improve the health of enslaved people. It's for the benefit of protecting the white population, the white enslaver population. So early hospital facilities along those lines. Over time, coming out of the colonial era into the early national era, we start to see private hospitals, and some of these are focusing on particular conditions, particular infectious diseases again, particular conditions that would have manifested through a slave ship journey that had an impact on skin and nerves, undermined digestive health or respiratory health. Those kind of conditions like yaws and dropsy, consumption, diarrhea, and really chronic infectious skin diseases. Of course, there was a great fear of leprosy at that time as well, but also scrophula, venereal diseases. So some of the advertisements, and this is the type of source that I will be using to do that research. The advertisements would draw attention to those conditions. But again, in the early national era, we start to see the transformation or the extension of the uses of the slave hospital as a space for medical education. So that becomes another sideline of the business, to offer these spaces to train medical apprentices, and sometimes in a largest number. That sometimes you'll get in those advertisements the number of students that this particular position could take on. So I could pick up from the antebellum period to expand on these various uses, if you will. But does that begin to answer that particular question?
It does. And I think the other thing I was trying to get at in the question is this notion of how we came in the modern era to understand these slave spaces and what that meant, not only for the narrative of slavery, but also the scholarship of slavery.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really important question, because these are, we really, beyond the advertisements and in the absence of thorough kind of archaeological investigations, and in the absence of any extensive documentation on these spaces, except for some exceptional cases, they are not as well known through the documentary record as one would like, and as a result, in part, have been greatly mythologized in their own historical moment by those who are seeking to defend the system of slavery, defend the white elite, white supremacy. So mythologized as being spaces that everyone who is in this business of slavery should aspire to build as effectively as possible to tackle any potential health problems on the plantation. And some ideal visions of slave hospitals are described in what James Breeden, in his edited collection from Southern Agricultural Magazines, describes as the ideal in slave management, which would apply to every aspect of running a slave labor camp, running a plantation, and the hospital space was there, and some elaborate structures are described in these agricultural journals. Nothing like the vision, the pro-slavery vision of the slave hospital seems to have left any architectural traces that resemble these descriptions, nothing remotely. So that vision, that pro-slavery vision, translates to some of the writing of the history of American slavery post-Civil War, very romanticized visions of those spaces. And so the early literature on slave health and welfare, prior to probably as late as the 1970s, is paternalistic, is idealistic, underrates the degree of suffering, high rates of infant mortality, high rates of maternal mortality. And despite the photographs that in one volume in particular, W.D. Postel's The Health of Slaves on Southern Plantations includes a photograph of the Mississippi State Hospital in Natchez, which incidentally was located at the Forks of the Road slave trading district. And it just looks like a grim shack. There's no disputing that, but still suggests that, again, this was kind of a model medical facility, and well run, well managed, etc. So that's kind of what scholarship since has been trying to overcome, these kind of mythologized visions of slave healthcare and kind of this utopian vision of the slave hospital.
Yeah, that came out very strongly in the article, this kind of dichotomy between idealization and realization. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the level of care and function of these spaces. I mean, to call them hospitals is, I think, generous. So sometimes, as you said, just shacks. And because there is another dichotomy between the human care of the patient and the commodity care of the property. And I would love for you to kind of unpack that a little bit and expound on it.
Yeah, certainly. No, that's great questions. Well, I think, I mentioned some of the sources that give us a way into reconstructing in an inadequate way, but we need to work with something. But the advertisements betray the kind of white enslaver mindset, and it's a racialized language. It's a capitalistic language. And on this, if you look at these advertisements in context, say from a newspaper from Charleston or from New Orleans or from Augusta, on the very same page, they're adjacent to the advertisements that are being taken out in the newspapers by slave traders. Of course, in many cases, these are one and the same people. So one of my questions right now is, how many of these physicians of various sorts, with some of them running these private infirmaries or something we might call a commercial infirmary, or having an interest in partly running education and clinical experience at college infirmaries, how many of them were slave owners? Well, if it turns out to be them all, what does that mean for narratives of medicine under slavery? I don't think it's going to surprise anyone at this particular moment, with the way the scholarship is accelerating and advancing and uncovering remarkable things at a great rate, that medicine and slavery were mutually constitutive, closely intertwined, benefited from the opportunities that each system, each institution brought to the other. And that doesn't make me happy, and I don't think it would make anyone else happy, really, to think of a system that should be striving to and an institution striving to reduce human suffering, instead was capitalizing on it in every way possible. That's kind of where I'm at with this.
Yeah, and that leads me to the next question, because you touched on the slave trade doctors and the role they played in the commerce. But once we get to the United States and the antebellum period, there was a real exploitative and professional interest in becoming a white slave doctor. And I'd love for you to talk about that kind of entrepreneurship and the way some of these doctors formed their practice around the teaching and instruction and kind of the pedagogical use of slave bodies. And I think Sims is probably a great way to.
Yeah, Sims is very well known, and the scholarship on the domestic slave trade, or the second Middle Passage in the US context, has sort of caught up with and fully revealed Sims to be what he was, someone very calculating, who was not only someone who drove indigenous peoples from the new territories that white settlers were moving into in Alabama, but chose to locate himself at the heart of what became the biggest slave market in the American South, with people coming in overland, by river, and eventually by railway, into the heart of the slave market there in Montgomery, just a stone's throw away from where Sims chose to locate his medical practice and what became his backyard and rather elaborate private infirmary. Behind the street behind Sims, South Perry Street, was a slave pen, was a slave jail. He could literally walk down to the fountain, the auction site, adjacent to which were large warehouses, where enslaved people were kept captive prior to sale, and select the people who may or may not have been generating a high price, or were sold for next to nothing, and make a claim to those people and try to profit from them by bringing them up to a saleable condition in his backyard private infirmary. So Sims is very typical, very representative of someone who capitalized on the trade. And he also taught students. The records of some of Sims's medical apprentices can be found in an MD thesis collection in Charleston, in the Waring Library at the Medical University in South Carolina. A good number of students wrote a thesis and wrote of their experiences observing Sims's operations and undertaking some operations, some new procedures for them, so thus experimental in those spaces. So while not a formal medical college, that backyard private hospital served multiple functions, including medical education. And of course, as everyone who knows about Sims is aware, experimental surgical procedures of various sorts on enslaved people across the life course, male and female.
Yeah, and that's one of the, American slavery is rife with contradictions and missed opportunities and all this sort of thing. But that idea of the slave health care as experimental for trying out procedures that ultimately would be used on whites, but at the same time, trying to find that racialized difference that justified the African American as a separate species, as someone deserving of enslavement, some innate quality that made the black different from the white, while at the same time creating procedures that would go on to, you know where I'm going with this?
Yeah. They probably were comfortable with the contradiction because the contradiction, there probably was not a contradiction for them in their own historical moment. This was something to be capitalized on, the whole business of so-called, as it was in its own historical moment, Negro medicine. Serve multiple uses. So at the one level, as you say, it shores up the system of slavery, the system of white supremacy, which always needs to be shored up because for centuries the same effort to find biological, scientific, medical proof of racial difference was an open experiment. So we see this, early on in Europe, and racial scientists finding allegedly at the biological level, at the skeletal level, some marker that seems to indicate from their observations, which were flawed from their inception, evidence of racial difference. And this goes on and on and on, and it serves the necessity of working against more humane visions of society in order to create a hierarchy, in order to divide people. And then it becomes this business opportunity, and it becomes its own curriculum with its own velocity that proves to be attractive to those who want to continue these practices and make money from a vulnerable population. And then a population that, as we move into the Jim Crow period, they would like to eliminate and argue are degraded and deviant and disappearing and will no longer be with us soon. These are the kind of arguments that emerge at the height or the nadir of Jim Crow and in the eugenic era. So it only gets worse, and the tradition is drawn upon over and over again by these medical racists and racial scientists, and trying to racialize every single part of the human anatomy and every single condition that manifests as a sickness gets racialized. It's not a glorious record by any means.
Well, yeah, in one of our discussions, we were talking about the fact that even today there's a deep rot in American healthcare as far as the disparity between white and black, and it literally begins on the shores of West Africa with these slave doctors choosing which people should be included on a boat, hiding sick people and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to, that was an aside, I wanted to, one of the great things about the article that I learned was this differentiation between the plantation shack and what would become city institutions. And what you discovered was how many patients were admitted by slave traders and slave merchants, so people who sold slaves in that period. And that transition through kind of the institution once people got here. And I'd love for you to talk about how those two institutions kind of developed and what was different among them.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's the case that we don't have outside of, to my knowledge, outside of the New Orleans context, anything like a hospital register or admission book. And so we do have that for those couple of hospitals mentioned in that article, the Hotel Dieu and the Toro Infirmary. And the Toro Infirmary admission book is a great big kind of classic archival leather-bound tome. Covers the period 1855 through 1860, and has a lot of useful categories of information for researchers. So you do get the person's name, you get the age, you get the gender, the last place from, and the length of the stay, how much the bill came to. Of course, in many ways, this is a business record, right? It's not really a record of care. So the remarks in relation to the condition of the patient, what the illness was, if there is any information entered in that category, is minimal. Not as bad as Fanny Kemble, who's also mentioned in that article. Not as bad as the paucity of information for the Butler Island Plantation Hospital book, which is it is purely a business record, and maybe just a record kept by the overseer in order to ensure that he got paid, that people were actually in this space. But back to the Toro admission book. So there is some information that perhaps gives us a sense of how long people were there in those facilities. But of course, what was most interesting in order to boldly underscore that close relationship between medicine and the slave trade and slave hospitals functioning as mechanisms to facilitate the slave trade at that point in time were the number of clients who were outright well-known slave traders. And there's probably a bunch more names in that same admission book that couldn't be clearly identified because they were a Smith or a Jones, and there's so many of those, or someone gave a false name as a client, paying for the people that they wanted to be in that facility, usually in order to provide some sort of evidence of people being in a saleable condition, what was known as soundness at that point in time, kind of colloquial term to describe a desirable state of health for enslaved people who were being put on the auction block, people who were being bought and sold. But I'd come back at the Toro Infirmary Hospital now, and quite some time after publishing that article, and see it really thoroughly embedded in the slave trading complex. And I would make more of the connections between that space and some of the adjacent businesses, the insurance building there. What I didn't know at the time that I wrote that article was that Ben Sadin, the hospital manager, the hospital physician, was a slave owner, and so were his assistants. And that's not uncommon. In fact, that's typical. That's the norm. I think it's pretty much the case with all of these guys that ran or owned a slave hospital. And some of them, in some locations away from New Orleans, again, overlaid, closely connected to some of the main hubs of the slave trade, are large slave owners, become very large slave owners, no doubt through being a key way station in these slave and trafficking routes of enslaved people. So that relationship is really close, really tight. In fact, probably one and the same thing, all part of the same business. No separation, really.
Well, and I would like to finish on this idea of how slavery and the slave trade and the slave hospitals created a professional class of doctors and contributed to our overall idea of a professional class of doctors. And one of the ways you illustrate this is by bringing in expert testimony in court cases and how slave doctors were brought in to testify in disputes and various other cases. So I'd love for you to kind of wrap us up on that professionalization via slavery.
Yeah, so yeah, that is a good window onto that process of professionalization, because it's somewhat peculiar in some ways to the Louisiana context, which has these reddition laws that someone who has bought someone who hasn't been sold in a good state of health can then make a legal claim to get the money back. And this is why we see so many physician testimonies deposited in these legal cases. And I only looked at a very small number. That overall set of cases that are kept in the archives in New Orleans would be saturated with similar sorts of testimony. So that is evidence of the process of professionalization, the recognition of the expert voice of the physician outside of the realm of medicine. But the slave hospital space also provides opportunities for physicians to enhance the credentials, the social and professional status in various ways. In the slave hospital contexts in Charleston, Augusta, Savannah, New Orleans, Atlanta, wherever we see a kind of medium to large size slave hospital, there's the opportunity to observe those cases and to publish on those cases and bring to the attention of the wider profession the clinical and surgical research going on in those contexts for this area, specialized, racialized area of medicine that was bringing in a great amount of profit, monetary profit for these doctors, and then they can make professional capital from this. And of course, journal articles circulate not just regionally, nationally, and internationally. So some of them are really boosting their reputations. These cases get reproduced in mainstream medical journals if they start out regionally. So some of them are going on to become leading members of medical societies, take leading roles in the national profession. The vast majority of these, those who survived to the Civil War, might take on a leading role in defending the system of slavery, a Confederate medical or surgical position. And if they survive that, they come back after the Civil War and get those leading medical positions back again. And the first thing they want is a position on, college faculty, or again, a leading role in the local medical association, a leading role in a hospital again.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.